There are some important announcements in the bulletin this morning, so please turn your attention to that, especially next weekend's activities. We got our kids program, and then on Monday we got our Christmas Eve service at 4 o'clock. And in preparation for that kids program next Sunday, they're having a practice this Wednesday that begins at 5:30, and they're going to provide dinner there for the kids. So please make sure to have your kids there for that if they're in the program. But of course, by far and away, the most important announcement in your bulletin this morning, probably the most important announcement that's been in there all year. No, not even this Sunday. Is that Heidi and I are hosting a Christmas party tonight at our home. It's from 5 to 8 o'clock. Just a come and go event. We're going to have food and drinks and snacks and drinks. She wants to emphasize, don't come expecting to have a full meal. There will be no steak served or pork chops yet. But we would just love to have you. This is our third time to do this. And we really do enjoy it. It's just our way of saying that we love being a part of this family, and we're grateful for this year that we've got to spend with you. And so we wanted to say thank you and have you over, whether it's for 5 minutes or 3 hours. We want you to come. That'd be great. Let's see. What else was I going to say in regards to that? That's all I was going to say in regards to that. So please come by. The address, in case you've never been there, is there in the bulletin, 3021 Heatherwood Drive. If you know where Retta lives, we just live a few doors down from her. But if that address doesn't do it for you, just come up and ask Heidi or I, and we can get you there. As in, tell you how to get there. Anyways, okay. John chapter 1. We're going to finish the prologue this morning. The prologue of John is the first 18 verses. It's where John lays out the foundational message of the entire book. He just lays it out there right at the beginning. You don't have to wait to understand what he's trying to say about who Jesus is and what he's done. He tells you everything here in the first 18 verses. And so we're looking at the last 5 of those, John chapter 1, verses 14 through 18 this morning. And so let's read what we're going to be discussing this morning, starting in verse 14. And the Word became flesh and dwelt among us. And we have seen his glory, glory as of the only Son from the Father, full of grace and truth. John bore witness about him and cried out, "This is he of whom I said, he who comes after me ranks before me, because he was before me." From his fullness we have all received grace upon grace. For the law was given through Moses. Grace and truth came through Jesus Christ. No one has ever seen God, the only God who is at the Father's side. He has made him known. So again, there is so much in just these 5 verses, but we're really only going to focus on one of them. But before we get to that one, probably most ultimate verse of the prologue, I want to look at verse 18. 18 is a massive declaration. No one has seen God, the only God. It is the God who is Jesus, who sits at his side, who makes him known. This is one of the most important for lack of a better word, functions of the Son of God. It is to declare who God is. It is to make him seen and known in the world. And in fact, many of the times where God is seen in the Old Testament, based on the text, you can almost always see that it's actually the Son of God making him known. It's another part of that Trinity. The Father, Son, and Holy Spirit, all in God, one, but all separate at the same time. It also makes a pretty powerful statement there in verse 17. It says, "For the law was given through Moses, grace and truth came through Jesus Christ." Now it's not, what is being said there is important, but it's the contrast, it's the comparison that he's making that is so significant. To the Jewish people that are reading this in the first century, Moses is everything. He's everything. He gave the law. He's the one who brought them up out of Egypt. And so for him to say, here's what Moses did, and here's what Jesus did, he's putting him up there with the transformative power to their belief system that Moses had. That was in and of itself, if not proved, a blasphemous statement. And for him to make such a claim as this, it's like when presidents and politicians come along nowadays and they compare themselves to George Washington and Abraham Lincoln and some of these guys who existed at incredible transformative moments, who did incredible things, and then they put forward like a tax plan or an immigration plan, and now I'm Abraham Lincoln, or now I'm George Washington. Well, no, you're not quite there yet. You're going to have to, set us free, lead us through, we were taken to the brink of extinction, and you bring us back from that. You're going to have to live up to that kind of standard to earn that kind of title. That's what John is doing here by putting Jesus with Moses. All right, so what else is he talks about John and the message that John brings. And we're going to talk a lot more about that coming up. Verses 19 through 20 deal with John the Baptist extensively. But John says this thing. He says, "This was he of whom I said, he who comes after me ranks before me, because he was before me." Now, what's interesting about that is that, John the Baptist actually came first as far as, birth, right? So he's making a statement about who Jesus is, that he is not just this person who was born here and now, but his origins go way back. And he is higher than me because he was before me. I was born before, but he was before. And that's exactly what John said at the beginning of the show. So, let's back up all the way to the statement of statements. Most relevant to what we're talking about during this season, verse 14. "And the Word became flesh and dwelt among us." Now think about what he's already said about who the Word is. The Word was with God, and the Word was God. Now that's who we're talking about here. Jesus, the Son of God, one and the same with God the Father, has become flesh, and he has dwelt among us. He has lived on earth as a human being. Now, we're pretty used to that thought, right? Especially, and you don't even really have to be Christian to be used to that thought because of this season in which we're now living right now, the Christmas season, where we celebrate the birth of Jesus Christ and how the Son of God comes down to earth in the form of a baby, and we got 100,000 songs singing about it, and we have 100,000 events during this month celebrating it in some way or another. And so we're just kind of used to that idea. But this is outrageous. This is scandalous. This is where most of the world's religions say, I'm out. No, it don't work that way. It doesn't work that way. I'm sorry. Most of the Jews in the world, this is where they say, among other things. Right here, God becomes flesh, walks around as a human being. You're not worshiping the same God I am. This is an outrageous, a scandalous, a statement that divides history. And if you don't really understand why, then you don't truly grasp, although granted it is impossible for us to fully grasp, the holiness and greatness of the God that we worship. This God who is uncontainable. This God who is eternal. This God whose holiness is unimaginable. Who spoke just with his words everything that we know into existence. This is the God that we're talking about. And this is a God who designed a system of worship in the Old Testament, all based upon his holiness. Remember the Ark of the Covenant, that in many ways represented his holiness. It was his presence existing among the people of Israel. And it's lost to time and age now, but at one time this was the center of worship in Judaism. Because it was his presence. It was where he resided. And so there were strong boundaries and rules set up to protect the people from the Ark of the Covenant. They had to be protected from the presence of God. They had to build things around it. They had to specify who was allowed close to it. And no one was allowed to touch it. I mean, maybe you recall the story of one time in the Old Testament, they were moving the Ark of the Covenant from one town to another, and it was on the back of a cart being pulled by an ox, and there was an accident, a wreck of sorts, and the Ark of the Covenant begins to fall off of this cart. And one of the servants of God lifted up his hand to keep it from hitting the ground, and he died instantly. There's another story of the Ark of the Covenant being moved from one place to another. It comes into a town, and they're all excited. And it was just kind of this, it got there on its own. God said, you put it on a cart, you strap a couple cows to it, and I'll take it where I want to take it. You just stay away. So it comes into this town called Bet Shemesh. And they're all rejoicing. They're all excited that the Ark of the Covenant has come back for us to be able to worship now. But unfortunately, a few of these guys in Bet Shemesh did, like, they went Indiana Jones, right? All on it. And they're like, we want to see what's inside, right? Yeah. So they look inside, and 70 of them were killed instantly. Because they wanted a glimpse of what was inside. And I'm sure it was just like the movie, I'm sure it was exactly like that. And I'm sure it was much more horrific. 70 of them just died like that. That's the God that we are now saying is coming and existing in the flesh. And we maybe you have do many of you have a nativity set at home? Many of you probably do. You have a nativity, and we nice up that scene a lot, and that's okay. I'm not, bashing on that. We want it to be a beautiful scene because it's a beautiful thing that God came in the flesh down to earth, but it was a messy business, all right? Babies are a messy business. We take pictures of them. Amanda does a great job taking pictures and making it look beautiful and all this kind of stuff, but being a baby is a messy business, right? We're past that, and I'm glad we are, because it's just mess all the time. It kind of cracks me up, when some moms will be like, I don't want you to get your germs on my kid, and I'm like, man, your kid is covered in poop. Like, what? I don't want to touch that kid. Keep that kid's germs away from me. You realize that? God himself comes down to earth and is now in such a form that he as a baby soils himself. That he is completely dependent for food, for warmth, for everything upon this girl and this guy who really have no comprehension of what's going on. Mary, did you know? Of course she had no idea, the gravity of the situation. And he's screaming like any baby does. He's been taken out of a place of warmth that he's grown used to, and now he's out in a cold, harsh world, so much harsher than anything that our children were born into. He's put into a feeding trough to keep warm. They didn't have a home that night. And his life doesn't really get much more glamorous from there. Talk about his humble beginnings, but didn't really he didn't climb the social stratosphere after that. He lives in Egypt for a while, being pursued by Herod the Great. He moves then to Nazareth, which only exists now. It still exists because Jesus happened to live there. It was a nothing of a village and a town at that time, which if he had never lived there, probably just would have been lost in history. Can you imagine? He's God. But he doesn't reveal who he is. He doesn't perform signs and miracles until the appointed time to bring glory to God by declaring who he is. And this doesn't happen until he's been on the earth for at least 30 years. Can you imagine being a God with all of the infinite powers that he has and living for 30 years on this earth without the assistance of your divine powers? Think of the pain that just in your 30 years you experienced. And we'll just start out with the simple pain, just physical pain. You broke an ankle playing soccer. You got strep throat. You had, ear infections. Maybe there were points in your life where you were hungry, where you were thirsty, where you were so hot you were going to pass out and get heat exhaustion. Think about the emotional pain that you experienced growing up. Like just having hurt feelings. I mean, I have a 6-year-old and an 8-year-old. That's like the currency we deal with right now. It's just all about hurt feelings. One of them are hurting the other's feelings. Even when they like punch each other straight in the face, it's more about like so-and-so hurt my feelings than it is about anything else. Experiencing having a kid come home because his feelings have been hurt by other kids at school. That's tough. He's God himself. How do you resist that temptation? How do you embrace being human and not give in to what had to be a very real temptation to expose the divine? Even just in the simplest of ways. Can you imagine if you had those kind of powers? Walking on the earth and you stub your toe. Boom, that don't hurt anymore. It's done. Like just the 100 million ways in any one particular day in which he could have made his life more comfortable. But he chooses to take this form of a human. Think of the injustice that you saw in your life in your first 30 years. The ways in which he could have set things straight when he saw murder, when he saw theft, when he saw hatred. The ways in which he could have immediately set things straight amongst his group of friends when there was bullying. You're telling me as a 12-year-old boy with the power of the Spirit of God, he embraces this humanity and becomes a human. The implications for us are too many to list this morning, but let's consider just 2 of them. I mean, this is what this whole season is about. It is the incarnation of God into flesh. Now, let's look at Philippians chapter 2, starting in verse 5. Have this mind among yourselves, which is yours in Christ Jesus, who though he was in the form of God, did not count equality with God a thing to be grasped, but emptied himself by taking the form of a servant. Being born in the likeness of men and being found in human form, he humbled himself by becoming obedient to the point of death, even death on a cross. Therefore God has highly exalted him and bestowed on him the name that is above every name, so that at the name of Jesus every knee should bow, in heaven, on earth, and under the earth, and every tongue confess that Jesus Christ is Lord, to the glory of God the Father. Let's go back to that first slide. The first 5 words of this passage. Have this mind among yourselves. The mind that would not cling on to the fact that he was God, but would let that go so he could take on human form. He doesn't grasp on to what he was and the titles that were his. He lets it go so that he can become man. He says, have this mind among yourselves. And that's the first implication for us, is that this is how Christ desires for you to live your life. That thought process that he had when he chose to leave the exalted place of heaven in the throne room of God to come here, that's how you're supposed to approach day-to-day life. To deny one's self. To seek first the good of others before yourself. This is the most difficult, and I would say I'm probably not alone in this room, but this is the most difficult struggle I have just in my day-to-day life, which is just self-denial. Choosing other people's needs and wants before my own. We're having a lot of people coming over this evening to our house. So yesterday, the Sabbath, keep it holy. Apparently it was more about cleaning, which I hadn't expected. But to choose, moment after moment, to deny myself and to choose to get up and clean and help my wife, who is always selfless in everything that I see her do towards us and towards me and towards our children. Man, there was football on yesterday. Yeah, This is Saturday. There's NFL games. Baker Mayfield's playing. What do you expect me to do? To deny myself in this moment? I'm really comfortable. I kind of have this really backwards, messed up rule, which is like whoever's closest is responsible for it. So I go and get on a corner in the far side of the living room, and Heidi needs me to get something. You're closer. Nobody else I know has ever done it. But choosing others, that was at the heart of what Christ did when he lowered himself to this place called earth. He was denying himself and he was choosing us. He was choosing the obedience. That is the incarnation. That is the story of the sacrifice of Jesus' life. Not just his death and resurrection, but the sacrifice of 33-ish years on this earth as human. The sacrifice of Christ on the cross is everything for us. It is salvation. Our redemption is found in his blood. Man, 33 years of sacrifice up to that point. It didn't just start at 9 a.m. on a Friday morning. He had been giving of himself and lowering himself and humbling himself for a lifetime. And Paul says, that's the mind that we have to have among ourselves. The mind of the incarnation. The mind of Christmas morning. Well, the temptations in the other direction are pretty obvious, right? It's to consider, instead of what do others need, what can I give, it's more about what have I earned. Right? What have you earned? A break? Recognition? Respect? Probably. I mean, Jesus earned, just in his own nature, all of the glory that he was receiving in heaven. He was owed that. He is owed that existence of being in the throne room of God, just by the nature of who he is as God. He says, I'm going to set those things that are owed to me aside for others. And so what do we take that we are owed, that I am entitled to, and say, yeah, the world would say this is mine, and I have every right to take it. But there was a baby that was crying and hungry in a feeding trough a couple thousand years ago who had that same choice. And he chose us. He chose what I would need 2,000 years later, which is a way back to God. And that's the second and probably greatest implication of the incarnation. It's that God is for us. He chose, as absurd and insane as it is, he chose us to give of himself everything. Not for just one morning, not for one afternoon of pain, but for an entire lifetime of lowering himself into the flesh of humanity. And we are to be imitators of that incarnation. I want you to look at back again at John chapter 1, verses 16 through 18. It really drives home this idea. For from his fullness we have all received grace upon grace. I imagine John just could have kept saying upon grace, upon grace, upon grace. And it all began with the incarnation. For the law was given through Moses, that which condemns us. But grace and truth come through Jesus Christ. No one has ever seen God, and no one will ever see God if he doesn't choose us. If he doesn't choose to share grace through his life, through his word, and through his love, no one does ever see God. You and I are lost in a hopeless life without him choosing the incarnation, choosing the flesh of humanity. He came to make a way possible for everyone. You know, there's a story that was shared with me this week, actually. one of these classic stories from Paul Harvey. And I do remember, by the way, I do remember hearing Paul Harvey on the radio in my dad's truck growing up. But he tells the story of a man who had a wife and some kids, and it was Christmas Eve. And Christmas was never a season that he really got into, and the idea of Jesus Christ was never one that he really got into either, because of this very idea, the idea of incarnation. The idea that God, the creator of the universe, would actually need to come down as a human and get on the cross and do all of this stuff to save us. If he's God, why can't he just do it? Why can't he just say, hey, you can come to me, just raise your hand. Why? The whole idea just seemed like a fairy tale to me. He didn't buy it. It didn't make sense. And he didn't really want to go to the Christmas Eve service that night. And they were having a midnight mass in the community in which he lived, and because he didn't want to be a hypocrite. I don't really believe in this, and so I don't want to be there and pretend that I do. And so when it came to leave, he told his wife and his kids, y'all can go on without me. I'll stay here. I'll be here when you get back. And Steve, the worship team can go ahead and come forward. So the family leaves, and shortly after the family leaves, it begins to start to snow. And the snow starts falling faster and faster, and he takes a seat in his living room next to the fire. He's got a good book. He's sitting there reading, waiting for his family to return, and he hears these thuds, 4 or 5 thuds up against this big window that they had in their living room to look out on their land. And so he goes up to the window to see what it was. It sounded like snowballs hitting the window. But when he goes and looks out the window, he sees a flock of birds sitting at the base of the window, completely knocked out of sorts. They'd been caught in this pretty impromptu blizzard, and they saw a warm place, and so in desperation, they were trying to get inside to the house. Now, this was a good man. He wasn't a hateful man. He just didn't really buy the whole Jesus in the flesh thing. That didn't really make sense to him. He didn't even want to see these birds die in his front lawn, and so he puts on his coat, he puts on his boots, and he goes outside. He's trying to get these birds to go into their barn where the kid's pony was. At least they can be, warm in there, and they'll survive until, and they can go on. So he goes over to the barn, and he opens the door. Turns on, lights up the lantern so they can see the way to get into a warm place, but they just sit there because they're stupid birds. Right? And he frustrates them, so he gets them, some food, and he's like, maybe I'll just tempt them in. I'll lure them into safety. I will lure them into a place that they'll be saved. Doesn't work. And he just does the whole thing where he just tries to kind of usher them in, just do this whole thing, just trying to flap the birds away, and it doesn't work. They just scatter in every direction. They don't go where he actually wants them to go. And he realizes, as you might as well, it's because they're terrified of him. And it begins to connect in his mind, well, as far as they know, I'm a big, terrifying monster. They don't know what I'm trying to do here in this moment. They don't know that I'm trying to usher them into salvation. I'm trying to save their lives out here. I'm miserable out here in this blizzard right now. And like a bolt of lightning, it connects in his mind in one moment that really the only way that you could possibly make these birds understand is to become one of them. If I could communicate with them, if I could actually speak bird language, I could go down there and I could say, hey, we're all dying unless we walk this way. Follow me. I know the way to salvation. I know the way to warmth. I know the way away from this place of death. The only way you're going to get there is if you follow me. Like a bolt of lightning. It connected in his mind who God was. And why Jesus had to come into the flesh. For thousands of years he had been working against the grain, with the law, revealing himself in many different ways, creating this nation of Israel in this place of worship, sending prophets, sending nations to destroy them and redeem them over and over again. But they weren't getting the message. It wasn't coming through that he was a God who desired relationship with them. And there was salvation to be found. And so he lowers himself out of glory into the dirt. And he takes on this form, this inferior form of humanity. And he speaks with a real mouth that can only say so much. He says, follow me. I am the way. I am the truth. I am the life. No one comes to the Father except through me. Let's worship this morning the incarnation of Jesus Christ, that moment of great sacrifice where he chose us. And let's listen to the Spirit as he calls us to be disciples of incarnation in the world where we live now. People who deny ourselves for the salvation of others. Would you be standing and singing during this time of invitation?